Mr. President, the bill that we have before us, the Defense Authorization Bill, I think we recognize is a pretty special bill. Every year for the past 51 years, Congress has sent to the President a Defense Authorization Bill which has been bipartisan in nature based upon the progress that we've seen here in this chamber for these past several days. It appears that this year will not be an exception. I deeply appreciate the strong leadership of our colleagues, the senator from Michigan, the senator from Arizona, in managing this bill. They have put in countless hours, have worked to wade through nearly 400 amendments that members have filed with respect to this bill. Not only the chairman and the ranking member and their leadership, but their staffs have worked incredibly hard, and I'm pleased with where we are. Now, Mr. President, I think you probably know that I'm one of those members that doesn't have a tendency to pile on or add multiple amendments to this measure or really to many measures. But on this bill, I've broken with that practice by filing 10 amendments to this bill. 6 of these amendments relate to frustrations that I have experienced in responding to force structure changes that were announced by the Air Force this last February. I think we recognize that force structure changes can be a euphemism for realignments, and realignments are usually reserved for a BRAC round. But faced with the need to meet rigid fiscal year 2013 budget objectives, the Air Force didn't wait for a BRAC round, and instead it proposed a series of backdoor BRACs. Most of these changes affected the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserves. But one of these changes would substantially realign and stop one step short of closing an active duty air base, and I'm referring to Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska. Last February, the Air Force informed the Alaska Congressional Delegation that it intended to make what they call a warm base out of Eielson, reduce its current population of about 3,000 airmen by half. The reduction would most profoundly affect the active duty population, which would be reduced by about 2/3. It would have led to the laying off of hundreds of civilian and contractor personnel. In the words of one prominent Fairbanks community leader, he said, "It's the Air Force's intention to change Eielson from a base that is mission capable to a base that is mission incapable." The Air Force somehow concluded that it could pull off a move of this magnitude without ever having to face a BRAC commission or answer to the Congress. That takes a little bit of chutzpah there. The Air Force knew that this was not going to sit well with the community. They promptly dispatched then Chief of Staff General Norton Schwartz to Alaska for a meeting with community leaders. I appreciated his presence, and I was there when he spoke to those leaders, but his message really didn't leave much room for optimism. Air Force officials pretty much insisted that this was a happening thing. Resistance is going to be futile. Now, I have to admit that it came as something of a surprise to me that the Air Force would select Eielson as the only active duty base slated for a backdoor BRAC. For those who aren't familiar with Eielson's strategic position, it sits at the gateway to the Pacific area of responsibility, the most strategically important area of responsibility, according to this administration's defense planner. It also sits at the front door of the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex, which the Air Force regards as its top unencroached training facility with tremendous future upside potential. But for some reason, this is the active duty base that the Air Force chose to essentially throw under the bus. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time. Back in 2005, the Air Force proposed to warm base Eielson. The BRAC Commission rejected that proposal. They instead suggested that the Air Force should place an F-16 aggressor squadron at Eielson to take advantage of its proximity to the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. And that aggressor squadron supports cutting-edge exercises like Red Flag Alaska, Northern Edge, superior, phenomenal training exercises. Under the Air Force 2012 proposal, that squadron would now base at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and they would essentially commute to future exercises launched out of Eielson Air Force Base. So, Mr. President, I'm left to conclude that perhaps there's just somebody in the Air Force that, for whatever reason, doesn't like Eielson. And I reach this conclusion with some hesitation and reluctance. But when I see the Air Force prepared to sacrifice a base with one of the longest runways in North America, it's a 14,531-foot runway, which I think you can appreciate is significant here. There are no encroachments, geographic superiority with respect to missions in the Pacific and really across the globe. It really does cause me to wonder. Now, since February, Senator Begich and I and our staffs have been in touch with the Air Force on almost a daily basis, trying to understand the Air Force's thinking here. And it's been a moving target. It's been tough to pin down. First, they claimed that it would save money in 2013, and then they admitted that, well, a move would cost unbudgeted money in 2013. They next claimed that the move could be accomplished without any NEPA review. Then they admitted that maybe an environmental impact statement is going to be required. They concluded that the move could be executable in 2013 because there was sufficient housing that was proximate to JBER. But then they came back and admitted that their housing availability data had come primarily off of Craigslist. Later, there was a more disciplined study that was conducted, and it demonstrated that if the move were to be executed in 2013, there was not going to be housing that was sufficient and proximate to JBER in order to relocate the airmen. And there probably wouldn't be sufficient classroom seats for the military families either. So just a whole series of issues that have cropped up because they weren't thoroughly reviewed prior to the decision being made. The Air Force has now conceded that its plans are not executable in fiscal year 2013. That's a wise decision. But it kind of begs the question, so what about the future? The Air Force may deny it, but I think reasonable minds could conclude that the Eielson plan is still moving full steam ahead. And let me offer the following in evidence of that. The Senate Appropriations Committee has directed the Air Force to spend no FY13 money to implement force structure change until the Commission on the Future Structure of the Air Force reports. And I think that that's a good thing, and I intend to argue Eielson's case before that commission. But I would note that Senate Bill 3254 requires the commission, which is only going to be created once the defense authorization bill is signed into law. It gives them until March 31 of 2013 to report. So essentially a 3-month period. That's absolutely not adequate time for the rigorous analysis that is required. So I have submitted an amendment here this week, Amendment 3135, which gives the Commission an additional year to complete its work. Now, notwithstanding this direction to stop, the Air Force has announced its plans to begin an environmental impact statement on the Eielson downsizing. They've announced that this will commence January of 2013 using FY12 money. Now, I do agree that an EIS is a legally required condition precedent to implementing the Air Force's structure changes at Eielson. And if the Air Force ultimately intends to downsize Eielson and add airplanes and people to JBER, it will have to complete the NEPA. Moreover, an EIS process will offer the Alaska community an opportunity to weigh in, to vent their frustrations and their concerns with the Air Force, which is appropriate. But one has to wonder, after reading the Senate version of the Defense Appropriations Bill, really what part of STOP is the Air Force not understanding? And I actually put this question to them in writing in September. I still have not received a satisfactory answer. Several of the amendments that I have introduced would bring this concept of STOP into the Defense Authorization Bill, but there may be an alternative to offering them, a solution that I think could be a win for all. It strikes me that an EIS is not going to address two questions that I think are critical and that I think should be answered before the EIS process begins. And the first is whether or not it makes any sense at all to throw Eielson under the bus given its considerable strategic upside potential. And the second is whether the Air Force will truly achieve any cost savings by walking away from Eielson or simply transferring costs someplace else. In addition, an EIS will not answer the question as to whether or not it makes sense for the Air Force to abandon a community that supports our airmen like no other community in the country. This is a community that loves to fly. You've got people that have float planes and small aircraft and bush planes. Everybody's a pilot there. They love to fly, but this community is more than willing to accommodate the Air Force's desire to conduct summer exercises at the expense of precious general aviation airspace, provided that the Air Force remains a good corporate citizen in the community. My Amendment 3156 is a good faith effort to find that common ground with the Air Force. And what it does is require that the Air Force submit a report to the defense communities evaluating the upside potential of Eielson Air Force Base before it acts to tear down that base or relocate its assets. And I'd take just a minute here to speak to some of that upside potential because I think it's considerable. It is a well-known fact in interior Alaska that the Air Force publicly announced scoping on an EIS for F-35 basing in Eielson back in 2008. So in 2008, they're talking about bringing the F-35s in. Then in 2009, they walked away from that announcement, but they suggested that Eielson would be a desirable OCONUS basing location for the F-35s. I might suggest that this abrupt downsizing that is being considered now of Eielson is inconsistent with that possible future use. You have the 168th Air Refueling Wing of the Alaska National Guard that fuels the North Pacific on a daily basis, every single day of the year. And there's been some discussion about adding an active association and increasing the tanker presence proportionate to demand. But downsizing Eielson could undermine the efficiency of that operation. I mentioned earlier the unencumbered airspace that Eielson has. This unencumbered airspace might make a perfect place for remote piloted vehicle testing. This is a mission that Senator Begich has been actively promoting for the past several years. So let's come to a conclusion about whether or not this is a viable possibility. And as the Pacific AOR becomes more important, Eielson might once again have the potential as a combat-coded fighter base given its proximity to the world's hotspots. But let's not also forget that Eielson is the air base closest to the Arctic, will certainly have new responsibilities in that rapidly changing part of the globe, and that's one of the reasons why the Department of Homeland Security needs to be part of this ongoing conversation. So before the Air Force moves to potentially throw away all of this and potentially demolish perfectly good facilities that might have support future missions, I think it needs to take a good, hard look at the upside of Eielson, not just merely recite the same old lines that quite honestly failed back in 2005. And that goes to the substance of the Eielson decision. In just a moment here to speak of the frustrations that I have had about process as we have gone through this since February. Congress has created a process to ensure that realignments that occur outside of backgrounds are vetted by the Congressional Defense Committees. But like many laws, the Pentagon is kind of looking around for loopholes. The Air Force has been pretty adept at identifying them, even if they might not actually be there. But there are some worthy amendments that I have submitted that would close the loopholes. These are contained in 10 U.S.C. 993 and 10 U.S.C. 2687. I hope that they will be considered. One of the more substantial loopholes that's contained in 10 U.S.C. 2687 would seem to allow the Defense Department to characterize a substantial reduction in civilian personnel as a reduction in force rather than a realignment. That loophole, if indeed it really does exist, I think needs to be closed. And let me also note the difficulties that we have had in obtaining from the Air Force information. Just asking for specific information has been a struggle these past several months. You ask the Air Force a question and you tend to get a heavily vetted and not terribly specific answer. Ask for documents explaining the deliberative process of the Air Force, and maybe you get one document months after you've asked for it, and again, the document doesn't explain very much. So perhaps it's time for personal offices to be able to use the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA process, to get the documents that they need in a timely fashion, just like journalists do. I have an amendment that I've introduced, number 3143, which would provide for an expedited review of FOIA requests to the Defense Department pertaining to its activities in a member's home state, with no fees charged for processing that request. I think it would perhaps level the playing field between the committees that can subpoena documents and personal offices who have a more limited option to obtain the documents that they need. I think it's a positive contribution to oversight. I hope that others here in the chamber would feel likewise. I will not be offering that amendment up at this point in time in the hopes that the Air Force is clear on my message that I would like to find a way that we can be working more cooperatively with this information exchange, and that there can be greater accommodation with the congressional requests. I know that General Welsh, as the new Chief of Staff, intends to improve the Air Force's relationship with the Congress. I've had a good conversation, a very positive conversation with him just about that. I want to give him that opportunity to do so, and I look forward to working with him on these issues and some of the others that I've had an opportunity to raise with him. I'd like to conclude my remarks by again thanking the chairman of the committee, the ranking member, all of the staffs for their yeoman's efforts on the bill. I look forward to supporting final passage and thank all of them for the efforts that they have made. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the